Thank you. And I'm very happy to be back for my second visit to the Key West Literary Seminar. I was here in 2017, and it was my introduction to the place, and I hope to be able to come back another time. This is an interesting presentation for me, and it has been, even though my book on Juneteenth has been out for over a year and a half, because the book is so different from what I usually do writing as a historian. I've spent most of my time writing about other people, other people's families, the Hemmingses, Thomas Jefferson and the Randolphs and their family, and not my own family. There's something that's comforting, I think, about being detached from the subject matter. Writing about your family is much more personal. You have much more at stake in that situation. And I have pretty much avoided that for most of my time as a writer. And I think my initial dream of becoming a writer, and the person who wrote novels and poems and the kinds of things that are being discussed here at the festival, grew out of the fact that I knew that writers mind their lives a lot for their material, and I was not that comfortable with doing that, just because I wasn't sure that other people in my family would want me to be writing about them in disguise or up front. So I pretty much left that beside, that kind of notion of becoming that kind of writer behind, and I became a writer, a historian, a writer about other people's lives. About maybe 2 or 3 years ago, my editor, Bob Weil, began to bother me about writing a book about Texas. And he wanted me to do a big book about Texas. He was thinking something along the order of The Hemmingses of Monticello, which is 800 pages, something that would tell the story of Texas through my family. And I resisted that for 2 reasons. The one that I mentioned before, that I didn't want to be personal, and also because I was still very much interested in writing about the Hemmingses, and I am in fact doing a second volume of the Hemmings family story. But Bob raised this question, and he put the bug in my head about thinking about Texas and Texas history. And 2 years ago, I did an essay for The New Yorker about the holiday Juneteenth, what it was like to grow up in Texas and celebrate the holiday. And it was sort of just a one-off, and I enjoyed doing it. And even before he read that article, Bob raised the question of Texas again. But this time he said, why don't you do something short? And that was more appealing to me. I thought that would be much more appealing to me, except that he said, and this is in June of 2020, I would like the draft by September. So I said, okay, which was, I thought, a crazy thing to do, but it was doable, something 30 to 40,000 words, 30,000 words, something around there, to do that by September. And if you're paying attention to the dates, you know that this is pandemic time. And Harvard had closed in March. I live in New York, and I commute to Cambridge for my job. But once Harvard closed and we went virtual, I stayed in New York. So while this conversation was going on, I was at home doing classes, finishing up classes, but then also preparing to do my next year's classes in my home from New York. And it made sense to me that I could do it under these circumstances, because if you remember, New York was ground zero for the pandemic at that time period, and we were there in Manhattan, And we weren't doing very much but staying in the apartment and occasionally walking out to Central Park for exercise and coming back inside. And while this was going on, it also made me think a lot about my family, think about my parents who are no longer living, and I wondered what they would make of this situation, where the entire world was pretty much at a standstill, held hostage by this virus. How would they think about this? What would they think about it? And as I thought about them, I began to miss them. And Bob's idea of writing about Texas and maybe putting my family into this appealed to me very much because I thought it was a way to get back in touch with my parents and my family. And so I sat down to write about this, and at the same time I thought it was a good thing for me to get in touch with thoughts about my home state. Texas has been in the news quite a bit, very often in the news for the past few years, and unfortunately, not for necessarily great things. And I have found myself, as a person who's transplanted from Texas to the Northeast, spending a lot of time explaining the state to other people. What's up with Texas? What's going on there? And I always thought that part of the problem was that people misunderstand Texas, or don't really know enough about Texas history to understand some of the things that are going on now that have their roots in the past. I say in the book that Texas is constructed as a white man. Texas is a white man in most people's minds. It's masculine, it is white, and what does that mean for people like myself who are not male and who are not white? But I'm a Texan. How do we deal with that? What does it mean if you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the state? Texas is the Southwest, but people I think mainly about the western part of that formulation. Texas is also Southern. Texas was part of, or wanted to be a part of, the Cotton Empire. The people who came to Texas in the 1820s and the 1830s, and then in large numbers when the Civil War started to try to escape the Union Army and to bring enslaved people with them, were strong supporters of the institution of slavery. Stephen F. Austin, who is considered the father of Texas, the capital is named for him, there's a great university named for him there, followed in his father's footsteps, who had been given the right to bring settlers into Texas and to settle them there, wrote that the only way this would work would be if they were allowed to bring enslaved people with them. He didn't say enslaved people, but to bring slaves with them. He said any white people who came to Texas without slaves could expect to be poor for a very, very long time if they had to cut the pine trees and plant the cotton and the sugar cane and cut the cane and all those kinds of things. So it started out as an institution, as a place that relied on the institution of slavery. And when Mexico outlawed slavery, it made them up in arms. The Mexican government gave them a dispensation because they understood that the Texians, as they were called, depended upon slavery. They gave them, and it made an exception, but the Texians never believed that they would hold to it. And so there was always this tension about the Mexican attitude towards slavery versus the Texians' attitude about it. And indeed, when Texas breaks away from Mexico, they did it in part because they wanted to maintain the institution of slavery. There were other things. The Mexicans had suspended the Constitution. There were cultural differences, language differences, but slavery was also at the heart of all of this. And that creates a problem because there's such pride in Texas about the Texas Republic. We were a republic. We were our own country. But you have to think about why, in part, we became our own country for that 10-year period, and that was to maintain the institution of slavery. My family I could trace on my mother's side my family back into Texas until the 1820s, before it's a republic, certainly before it's a state. And on my father's side, to the 1850s. They were people, and if you look at the census, you can see that they were people, their mothers and fathers were born in Mississippi and in Alabama, in Georgia. They were brought over with white settlers who came to clear the land and become a part of the Cotton Empire. So and then after slavery is over, Texas joined other states in creating a system of Jim Crow. So if you think of Texans mainly as about cowboys and cattle ranchers, the story that's told in the movie Giant, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, if not seen, which is a story of, once upon a time, there were cattle ranchers, and they ruled the roost in Texas, and then the oilmen came, and then they fought, and then they became friends. And that's what Giant is essentially about. And you leave out the plantation owners. There are no black people in the movie Giant. I love the movie, but that conflict is not portrayed at all. It's mainly white and Hispanic, which is important to focus on, but to leave out the fact that Texas was part of the Southern Plantation Empire doesn't give you a sense of what the place was like. So I thought I could tell my family story, a brief part about my family story, and sort of weave that into this history of Texas to remind people that this is what you're dealing with. We're not dealing just with cowboys in the West. We're dealing with a part of the South. And I'm sure you can tell a similar story about Florida and its relationship, how people can kind of see it sort of as strange because they don't understand the kind of multifaceted nature of the history and the fact that it was connected, obviously, to the institution of slavery. So I wanted to repeople Texas, to write a book that puts all kinds of people into Texas back into the picture, to sort of complete the story, to round it out, to raise this question about Texas as a place of where we focus a lot of attention on the place. People see it in some ways as things that are going on there as precursors for things that are going on other places. To make people understand that the legacy of slavery and race and Jim Crow still affects what's happening in the state today. A lot of the battles that we're having now in Texas about history, about what can be taught, grow out of this legacy and the shame and the anxiety about all of that. And to just open the picture up a bit. So I set the story up talking about Texas as this strange place, and I immediately jump into something very personal. I talk about my time as a first grader in Conroe, Texas, when I integrated the schools in our town. I was the first black child to go to white schools in Conroe, and what that was like. This is the mid-'60s, it's 10 years after Brown, and my home community, as were many communities in the South, was resisting Brown. And one of the ways they resisted it was to come up with something called a freedom of choice plan, under which white parents were supposed to choose freedom of choice. Who could be wrong? What could be wrong with that? It's great, right? White parents would choose white schools, and black parents would choose black schools. My parents decided to do something different with me. They chose to send me to a white school. And this was a big deal for many reasons, but also because my mother was a teacher in Booker T. Washington, which was the black school in town, K through 12. And my older brothers were in Booker T. Washington. And in fact, I went to Booker T. Washington as a kindergartner. But when we came to, I love these roosters. It wake you up at like, all hours, all hours. Booker T. Washington, I went to kindergarten in Booker T. Washington, and when the time came to go to first grade, my parents decided to send me to Anderson Elementary School. And I'm sure some of you have seen the picture of Ruby Bridges, who integrated the schools in New Orleans. And the famous picture of her being escorted by the marshals, and I think Norman Rockwell has done a painting of that. My situation was not like that. My parents and the school district and what passed for the press in our town, which is just a newspaper, decided that I would just go to school. There would be nothing would be made of it. I would just go. And my father took me to school and dropped me off. And that was the beginning of my time at Anderson. And I have to say that my teachers were fantastic. Mrs. Daughtry, my first grade teacher, we all remember our first grade teachers' names, could not have been better. And after I wrote the book, and this always happens when you write a book and you're looking at it and you're thinking about it, I said, I should have said this. This is something I didn't think of. I wonder if the fact that my mother was a teacher did not help account for how they treated me. I mean, Mrs. Daughtry, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Gilliland, my second grade teacher, they were wonderful people. But I wonder if the fact that my mother was a teacher didn't add a little to that, and they were much more protective of me because of that. But the adults could not have been better. Some of the children were not so great. Some of them were good. Others went out of their way to be, friendly to me. But some were not great. And I learned at that time that not all people are the same. You have to take them as they come and what they present to you. And I would say overall, it was a tough and a tense time. My mother said at one point I broke out in hives. I don't remember that. But in the way that you do when you're remembering things, I think much more about the fun. I think much more. We sort of get the rose-colored glasses on things when you're looking back at it. But I would say for the most part, I enjoyed my time at Anderson Elementary School. The town was it was a tough town. It was a place where there had been a lynching. There had been lynchings throughout the late 19th and the 20th century. A man had been burned at the stake on Courthouse Square at the end of the 1920s. And the town had a reputation for hardness. And so I mention all of this in the book, and I talk about it. I call it a Texas town to sort of explain the atmosphere, what the place was like when I went there in the 1960s. It was, as I said, not just the segregated schools, but when we went to the movies, we sat in the balcony, blacks sat in the balcony, and when we went to the doctor, the clinic, there was a separate waiting room for us, much smaller, not large enough to contain everybody. And that was the world that I started out in, and I thought it was important to begin the story there, to talk about the peopling of Texas, with me as a people, as a person, to say I experienced the legacies of all of those things that happened before. And it's within living memory, obviously, that these kinds of things were taking place. Then I talk about the fact that there were people of African descent in the area that was Texas and Florida in the 1500s. Most people probably think about the beginning of the black experience in North America with 1619. It begins in 1619, and that is, in fact, an important date. That's an important date to keep in mind. And it's an important date because it sort of pinpoints the beginning of the sort of English experience with slavery and the institution of slavery, and the English won. They won the struggle for North America with Spain and France and so forth. So it makes sense to start there. But you shouldn't forget that there were people here before then. Estebanico, I write about, who was in Texas in the 1520s, who washes up on the shore of Galveston with Cabeza de Vaca and the remnants of an expedition that had been shipwrecked off of Florida and made their way across the Gulf of Mexico to the coast of Texas. And then they end up walking across Texas almost to California. And Estebanico was a translator. He had a gift for languages, and he translated among the native peoples, indigenous people, and the Europeans. And so to start this journey there and to talk about the fact that there were other people of African descent who weren't all slaves, and even the ones who were enslaved, sometimes they left the expeditions and they went off into Mexico and down to Veracruz and started colonies and became part of the people there. So there is an Afro presence in Mexico and Central America that starts from this time, from the 1500s. And I say in this chapter, I want to reclaim, my hope is to reclaim them as origin stories as well. Just because they speak Spanish doesn't mean that there was not a connection to the people who were enslaved by the English and happened to speak English. Their circumstances were similar. Then I want to bring the First Nation people, the indigenous people in Texas. I mean, Texas has always been a multicultural place. It didn't just, not like states that became multicultural afterwards, it was always from the very, very beginning. And the different Indian groups, and I talk about growing up in the 70s when Indian chic was sort of the rule of the day, where we wore Indian-type clothing, and it was the height of the American Indian movement, as a matter of fact, in the 1970s. And so I start off talking about the fact that I grew up watching television programs in which Native American peoples were depicted as if they didn't exist anymore. And the title of the chapter is The People of the Past and the People of the Present, to say they didn't just disappear. They are here, and they've always been here. And I know that because I happen to be born 17 miles from the Alabama Coshada Indian Reservation. And during the 70s, it was a thing for us to do, was to go to the Indian Reservation, and we saw people, and now it's become a much bigger deal. I think they gamble now. It's a much bigger deal than it was back then. But this idea of people who were there but somehow gone, but were nevertheless still there, a part of Texas, was, I thought it was important for me to bring that out as well. And then the question of the mythology of Texas. A big part of that, obviously, is the Alamo, which I'm sure all of you remember. The Alamo as this place of a famous last stand. I mentioned this yesterday, in Texas we take Texas history twice, in the 4th grade and the 7th grade, and you can take it again in high school. So I had 3 years of Texas history, and I learned about the Alamo, but I learned about it as a heroic thing, a heroic struggle. The idea of people who were standing for what they believed in and willing to die for what they believed in. But as I mentioned before, part of the things that they were fighting about in the Alamo was the right to have a Texas republic that had the institution of slavery as its economic base. So what do you do if you're a black kid, or even a white kid who is anti-slavery, who happens to be anti-slavery? What do you make of Davy Crockett and Jim Bowie and those group of people, and William Travis, who are the heroes, people that I knew, from my Texas history books and was taught to revere? What do I do when I know that they were slave owners, and not just slave owners, but people who were actively fighting a battle to maintain this institution? So you complicate that. The chapters Remember the Alamo, and I complicate that and talk about how it has come for even black Texans to mean something above and beyond just the bare facts of this particular story, and how people use mythology to send messages. But when you really investigate what's going on there, it's much more complicated and much more layered than people had been led to believe. So there's actually a book called Forget the Alamo that came out at the same time as On Juneteenth. And it actually has been, the subject of a lot of controversy. I don't think they allow it to be sold in the bookstore at the museum at the Alamo, and I think someone was prevented from speaking there. I guess my chapter, Remember the Alamo, doesn't really tip people off to the fact that it's a critique. It's a critique, but that's a really sore subject, as you can imagine, in Texas. And then finally, I end up with On Juneteenth, an essay about the holiday itself, which again is very, very personal. And I go back to talking about my family and my family's own connection to Galveston, which is central to Juneteenth, when Gordon Granger comes to Galveston on June 19th, 1865, and announces the end of slavery in Texas. And I was speaking with someone yesterday who said that there's somewhat tension now because other states celebrate different days for emancipation. I think Florida may have a different day for Emancipation Day. And why is it that Juneteenth has become the national holiday? And I think it's because Texans have been campaigning for it. Juneteenth was, when I grew up, a holiday mainly for black people. In 1980, Texas made it a state holiday, and then whites began to celebrate it as well. And one of the great things about this whole process is then after my book came out in May, it became a national holiday in June. And I had the privilege of going to the White House for the signing of the bill, along, with a lot of the people who had been working very, very hard to make it a holiday. That was not my purpose in writing the book. I didn't think that was going to happen, but it helped a lot. It was very good. I'm hoping what this will do is to sort of raise awareness about emancipation, that emancipation was not just one day. It was a process that soldiers of the United States of America, enslaved people themselves, made possible by their actions. And I want to start a conversation about all of this. I mean, I know that there will be a day when it's mainly about white sales and mattress sales and car sales and all of this, but until we get to, this is the United States after all. Before we get to that, I want to have a conversation about this. I mean, the book is really trying to say that all of us, every one of you, could tell the history of a part of this country through your family, through the things that were going on with your parents and your grandparents and all of these. And I'm hoping that one of the things I've suggested is that Juneteenth will be a day when people take family histories, where young people will be encouraged to talk to their parents and their grandparents and other older relatives about their lives. I mean, we don't have anything maybe so momentous as the institution of slavery, but, we've just been through a major cataclysm here with the pandemic, and I don't think we even realize what has happened, how it has affected us. And historians are going to look back at this time and want to have histories, oral histories of what happened and what it was like from people personally. So the book was a personal journey for me, but I hope it's also a clarion call for other people to do the similar kind of things. Even if you don't publish it, but to create something that historians and other people can use to say that we're all a part of history. And it's not just, I think, for historians, professional historians, to tell that history. It's for all of us. And so with that, I think I would like to take questions. Someone has a microphone that's coming over here.
We have time for one question. Thank you very much for all the work you've done in Texas. My mother and father married in San Antonio, Texas. And I'm curious as to what is happening as a result of your book. What has been the reception in Texas to your book? And secondly, how is the Alamo going to be taught in the future in the high schools of Texas?
Well, you know, the reception has been good, actually. I've been there. I was there every week for about 4 weeks at different places talking, and it's been very, very positive. I don't know how they're going to teach it. I don't understand how you can teach about the Republic of Texas without the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, which says in it that it is created to support the institution of slavery, which says that people of African American descent can't come to the state and live and can't be citizens. I mean, it's a primary document. And it would be the height of irresponsibility to say that you're teaching about the Republic without teaching about that document. So what I'm hoping, and I think I said this yesterday, is that parents and people who want real history to be taught have to stand up and have to push back against these things. I mean, there are some things that are inappropriate. We can talk about, you know, people can introduce their children to difficult topics when they are ready to do so. But there's some things that are just so basic that I don't understand how you're going to have an educated populace, which is what education is about. I mean, that's one of the positive things about Jefferson and his mania about public education is that you can't have a republic, a true republic, without citizens being educated. And if you keep things from people, you are doing the opposite of educating them. So it's really filling me with a lot of concern about some of the things that are going on, and I hope people push back more against that.